Hey, check, check, check. Testing, check. Check. Check.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I think we're going to start. Yes, it is echoey. Is it less echoey now? We're better? Yes? No? Okay, thank you. Mike, are we good? Great, thank you. Okay. So, I am so happy and honored to present our keynote lecture. Poet and translator Peter Cole, who is one of my literary heroes for many years, And I'll just introduce him very briefly for people here who may need an introduction. Peter has soon to have published 6 books of poetry. His forthcoming title is called Draw After Me. It's coming out soon with FSG. Draw Me After, I'm sorry. He is also a prolific translator from Hebrew and Arabic. Some of my favorite titles are the poetry of the Kabbalah, mystical verse from the Jewish tradition, the dream of the poem, Hebrew poetry from Muslim and Christian Spain, both of it which are very relevant to the greater topic of our conference, as well as the poems of Taha Muhammad Ali, the Palestinian poet, and several novels by Yoel Hoffman, among many other translation projects. He teaches at Yale and has received numerous honors for his work, including fellowships from the NEA, NEH, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Jewish Book Award for Poetry, the Association of American Publishers Hawkins Award for Book of the Year, the Penn Translation Award, and so on and so forth. I will not go over his many, many accolades. And I am incredibly glad he's here to talk to us about piyutim and the way they have shaped his own poetic work and work as a translator. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Shir. And I just want another round of applause for the exhausted Shir who has brought us all together. I want to say that, well, I'm tremendously honored to be here. And I want to say that, in a way, I don't think you have any idea how honored I am to be here, because before having met all you and heard all these talks, I don't think I really understood what an honor it is. The 2 days together has been so rich and so varied, and the presentations have had sort of such freshness and candor, and you've all been spending your lives in this field. When Shir asked me to give this lecture, I was surprised, first of all, and touched, and as I say, honored, but also thought, well, what am I going to talk about? And I decided to do what I guess do increasingly as I get older, which is, I wear all these hats, the different translations, the different fields that Shir mentioned, and my poetry, and then there's the teaching and prose writing, and I decided to talk about none of that and to talk about what I know least, but what has meant an awful lot to me. And so I hope that at the end of this talk, you'll understand why, in fact, I'm so much more honored than I even realized I was going to be. So my angle of approach will be quite different from all the talks have been very different. That's one of the refreshing things. So I hope this continues in that vein of difference and surprise, and that all the bells and whistles, Alexander helped me here, that they work. If they don't work, he'll come running up with his fire hose and deal with that. So without further ado, a way of happening, a mouth, on petition and repetition in Baqashot, or when the best translation isn't exactly a translation. As a translator of original material that often seems to have been written in invisible ink, which is to say a poet who at any given moment might or might not hold the secret chemical or sympathetic reagent that would allow him to read the textures and orders of the world around and within him. I've always found it hard to resist Walter Pater's slippery but conductive dictum that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. As though I'd felt that the music of a poem in its emergence or emergency would lead me to the right rendering for the moment. So it's at least interesting to ask what it is that music itself has sometimes aspired to, especially when it comes to the convergence of words and notes in the singing of Hebrew liturgical poems, or piyutim, those products of piesis, as the Greek has it, the making that gives us poems, and in particular to the hymns known as Baqashot, or petitions, which knocked my inner socks off when I first encountered them in the middle of an autumn night some 40 years ago in Jerusalem's Bukharin Quarter. What was it about those petitionary hymns that floored me then and began rewiring my sense of what it is that words in a poem might do? And it seemed requiring something new of me, or, as it happened, something old. As in the pre-14th century French requer, to beg, ask, petition, demand, and the Latin requirere, to seek repeatedly, which is, of course, exactly what was happening in that Ottoman-inflected rite that took shape in the 16th century Galilee. It didn't hurt that there was snuff and cardamom coffee, boiled potatoes with a viscous and mildly spicy fenugreek condiment, chilba, mint tea, and also, for those who knew those in the know, whiskey from a coat pocket flask. We thank Almog for the arak at lunch today. We'd start at 3 in the chilly morning, chorus and counter-chorus, a row of soloists facing each group at the modest Musayov synagogue, its beadle in a tacky plaid sports jacket and jarring fedora, banging a table, then banging it twice, as a low rumble rose, like a fog from the pool of the people huddled along benches on all sides of the room. That hidden God in concealment's pavilion, the mind withdrawn from all conceiving, was far from anything I'd ever heard or even heard of before, let alone taken part in. The peace, and you could feel it along your spine, power of those psalms and the medieval or later canticles stretched out over quarters of an hour till dawn. Letters ascended and letters slid down or hovered over for a kind of forever. It was heaven, you could say, with Peter Falk's happily fallen angel in Wim Wenders's Wings of Desire, who was talking to an infinity-weird fellow messenger from the world on high about hot dogs, cigarettes, and coffee in combination as one of the reasons why it was worth leaving immortality behind. Exhortatory shouts, the occasional fist fight, an 8-year-old's voice cracking along his narrow solo, and the chorus resuming as though with a blanket to cushion his fall and toss him gently back up onto the scale. Then Kaddish, the street brightening under a platinum sky, a sprig of purple basil, and the walk through empty downtown home. 2. I've long been a listener to a wide range of musics, played, sung, and spoken. From quotidian banter on the street to Herman's Hermits and Freddie and the Dreamers. Curious. That may not ring any bells for very many people in the audience, but for those who do. From the American Songbook to Bob Dylan and the Beatles and Fountains of Wayne. From the tactile calculus of Glenn Gould's transcendent Bach to the graduated billows and fall of William Byrd's Masses and Cantiones Sacrae, or sacred songs. From the heart-stretching harmonics of Ivor Gurney and Frederick Mampu. Who? On to the reticent ecstasies of Morton Feldman and Steve Reich, with the history of jazz, Satchmo and Nina Simone, Monk and Chet Baker, percolating in syncopated fashion. For all the abstraction brought about by its birth through number and measure, music, when it's working, even through a laborer's whistle, compels immediate and sensory assent in a way that poems can only dream about. Though, as Emily Dickinson shows us, dream they do. Musicians wrestle everywhere. All day among the crowded air, I hear the silver strife, and waking long before the morn, such transport breaks upon the town. I think it that new life, When push comes to shove, it's hard to think of any music that has mattered more to me as a poet or more fundamentally informed my feeling for language than those Baqashot. And that's what I want to talk about today, what I'm already talking about, why it mattered, and how that mattering unfolded through me as just that, matter. Granted, the lack of pretension appealed. These Iraqi, Syrian, Turkish, and other Mizrahi shopkeepers, travel agents, workers, rabbis, students, and chazanim had for years gotten up in the middle of the one night a week, after which they didn't have to go to work. This was Israel of the early 80s with its 6-day work week. Many of them, violating the Sabbath for the sake of the Sabbath, would drive in from the newer Jerusalem neighborhoods and park well beyond the cordoned off or barricaded religious quarters. So there was a roughed up sense of the ritual involved, distinctly unsanctimonious and credible to a poet's craving for groundedness, or this poet's, let alone the still deeper rootedness in language. And of course, the throbbing novelty of it all called out, since nothing or next to nothing in my semi and then suburban New Jersey upbringing had prepared me to attach the word Jewish to a scene like this one. And then beyond the great swerve of a cultural translation, the whole thing entailed for me the physicality of the transport took hold, the intricate slippage and glide among the pliant microtones, the music's capacity for reflecting facets of Hebrew I'd never quite noticed or absorbed, the nuclear ways in which the music seemed to split words open and send what they contained through me like that coffee and whiskey. In his Judeo-Arabic treatise, the Kuzari, Yehuda Halevi marvels at the power of the sensual spiritual apprehension he calls dhawq, or taste, leaning on Sufi epistemology, along with the synesthesia of Psalm 34:9, O taste and see. A compound of intellectual and sensory apprehension, that taste of what the Hebrew was talking about seeps through the throat and the mouth in the closing lines of the opening Baqashot, which has cast its melodic plumb line down through the network of Kabbalah's 10 supernal emanations or sphirot, and arrived at a culminating statement of the unity of those inner faces, as Sholem called the sphirot, or as Harold Bloom provocatively put it, those turns of language that substitute for God. The asymptotic, tune-born reach of the last two four-word Hebrew lines functions here very much like the never quite knowable four-letter name toward which the sound and sense of the hymn have been flowing and drawn, as the final verse translates the infinite dimension of that name into the concrete present of the song brought near or through us in that room. The divine names are themselves the sphirot, says the great Safedian Kabbalist Moshe Cordovero in his 1587 introduction to Kabbalah, Or Ne'erav. And each and every letter is a separate world, Abraham Abulafia had written several centuries earlier. Moreover, each of those letters, several later Kabbalists have proclaimed, or sensed, or known, has a body and a soul and contains the 10 sphirot within it. 3. Others have written about what it is that Pater had in mind as the condition of music. A self-sufficient and essential repose intention goes one persuasive version of that. And Pater himself makes it clear that of all the arts, music most fully and ideally achieves its blessed rest through, quote, the perfect identification of form and matter, ends and means, the subject and its expression. He notes that while in all other kinds of art it is possible to distinguish the matter from the form, yet it is the constant effort of art to obliterate that difference, which is to say to transcend the untranslatable charm and limitations of its own medium. This he calls in other striving, in Anderstreben, in the German critical parlance of the day. It's a reaching intended to pass into the condition of some other art, so that the different arts in question might, quote, reciprocally lend each other new forces. All this for the sake of transposition to something greater than either of the arts had previously been on its own, and therefore not art for art's sake. In fact, says Pater, this other striving to be both of its medium and to take one through it and beyond lies at the heart of all artistic aspiration. Earlier in Pater's century, in sketching out a plan for a poem he was in his notebook calling an ode to music, Samuel Taylor Coleridge perhaps had something similar in mind when he wrote of how music brought him back to primary feeling and perhaps did really make moral regeneration. And Theodore Adorno raises the metaphysical stakes and brings us very close to our subject in suggesting that and this is Adorno, what music says is a proposition at once distant and concealed. Its idea is that the form, Gestalt, its idea is the form, Gestalt, of the name of God. It is demythologized prayer freed from the magic of making anything happen. The human attempt, futile as always, to name the name itself, not to communicate meanings. One doesn't have to have a conspicuous talent for religion, as Friedrich Schleiermacher puts it in On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. Or as he says elsewhere in that 1799 collection, a developed taste for the infinite in order to understand what the writer of the 10th century Islamic Brethren of Purity's Epistle on Music means when he observed that melodies and rhythms have the power of transporting the soul from one state to another, of bringing it into joy and sometimes laughter through the vibrations of strings, and from there through a change of tuning into a sadness that softens the heart and makes tears springs from the eyes. And we heard that last night very well with the ensemble, with Yair and Roli's ensembles. So too, a sensitive 21st century analogizing agnostic could conceivably appreciate certain Kabbalists over the centuries constructing parallels between the hollows and cavities of the lute or lyre-like stringed instrument known in Psalms as the kinnor, and those of the human body. Brings us back to Hadar's talk yesterday. And she might even respond to those physicists of inner space and the beyond, calling what moves through both the body and the musical instrument a presence, in this context, of the divine, the Shekhinah. And some with a predilection for another sort of rarefied fooling around with language will, I suspect, smile as they recognize something they almost already know from the most radical of all the Kabbalistic authors, the proto-postmodern Abulafia, who in his book of the life of the world that is coming, associates the transformative capacities of music and prophetic inspiration when he writes that the secret of the Garden of Eden, or Gan Eden, is anagrammatically ad nagen, until he plays. Gan Eden, ad nagen. You can hear the rustling, or yes, the wrestling of letters, Gimel, Nun, Ayin, Dalet, as Abulafia himself plays on 2 Kings 3:15, where Elisha the prophet calls out, "Now bring me a musician." And it came to pass when the minstrel played, and the hand of the Lord came upon him. ועתקחו לי מנגן, והיה כנגן מן המנגן, ותהי עליו יד י"ה. In other words, the secret of Eden and its garden lies within the letters that give us the sense of what someone had sensed or done. The spell or spelling is all. Pushing the envelope further, we can venture that skeptical aesthetes might have more than an inkling of how it is that in these petitionary schemes, song or poetry, shira, is said to extract light from vessels of sound. And letters are called palaces for the revelation of the light of the infinite, Ein Sof, which is clothed within them. Psalm 119, 130 provides the constitutive cue. Petach dvarecha ya'ir. The opening or opening up of your words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple, which could also be the entrance into your words gives light. A bridge further still would be one of the several modern prefaces to the great 17th century Yemenite, Hebrew, and Arabic poet Shalem Shabazi's Diwan, or collected poems, wherein the writer notes that, quote, it is incumbent upon every Jew to sing, lezamer, and direct or conduct, lenatzeach, songs, praises, hymns, and melodies to arouse the lily of Sharon to sing a sweet song. In passing, just let me note the severity or guided violence of inner and outer judgment implied by the associations of the word lezamer with singing, strength, and even cutting back or vengeance, and of lenatzeach not only with directing, but being victorious and enduring, in this case, in the soul's struggle or psychomakia. There is great profit in this, the editor adds, for the beings on high and also for the soul, which without this song would not be filled with the lights of the upper radiance. It is like the case of those who descend to the chariot, the Merkava, and utter songs. From the power of these songs, the gates of the chariot are open before them. They enter into its palaces and gather the power to ascend higher and higher. They continue to move only so long as they continue to sing. As it is written of songs, there is true mystical tradition or reception, Kabbalah, in them. Still, our quorum of quamists should identify easily enough in this Yemenite scene of descent for the sake of ascension the luminous detail of the common root in the words Merkava, chariot, and Harkava, composition, both of which stem from the letters Resh, Kaf, Vet. And maybe they'll hear a distant echo of what's implied there in Ralph Waldo Emerson's saying that all language is vehicular. We'll return to those complicated chariots and letters shortly. For now, as we head more directly into the rites of petition and repetition that the Baqashot are, we do well to introduce into the record a Zoharic passage, which tells us that song is at the root of everything that matters, and in fact, of matter itself, and certainly the materiality of language. The first word of the Hebrew Bible, says the Zohar, Chadash, should be read not as Bereshit, but with its letters scrambled again, anagrammatically to yield Shir Ta'av, song of desire, Ta'av, song of desire, or Ta'ev Shir, desiring song. Though we don't need to get so esoteric about it. One evening after dinner not long ago at our apartment in Jerusalem, I played some old cassette recordings of the Musayef Baqashot for two friends, a Russian-American-Israeli prose writer and an American-born and bred eye surgeon. As informed Jewishly as they were, in a more broadly cultural sense, they wore their observance lightly, often invisibly, while El Mistater and the piyutim that followed unfurled themselves in the space of our living room, scratchy recording and all. One of the singers had given me the cheaply produced set of tapes in the early 1980s, which is what we heard before and some of what we'll hear afterwards. The couple listened intently from the couch. What they were making of it, I couldn't tell, but I saw no indication that I needed to press the stop button. After some 15 or 20 minutes of it, I got up, it was late, and turned off the tape. The doctor stirred, rubbed her eyes over her face, and said, clearly shaken, "Why does that just make me want to cry?" And they ride on the ladder of ascending sounds and descend and are united with them, says Cordovero. Though here too there is an earlier and inkier literary analog, also from the Zohar, and the earth was void and without form, dregs of ink clinging to the point of a pen. And the world was graven with the 42 letters. When they're combined, letters ascend and letters descend, forming crowns for themselves in the four corners of the world, which come to exist through them, and they through it. Then again, given that envisioning of creation and recreation, really, why do without the Kabbalistics, which is where it all began, in the beginning, desiring song? To rise on high and descend below, to ride, oops, did I miss something? I seem to be missing something here. Alexandra, I don't think even you can help me with this. All right, we'll skip it. Yeah, a slide seems to have fallen out, or I put it in the wrong place, or the arak has worked its way into the computer. To rise on high and descend below, to ride the chariot's wheels and explore in the world, to wander on earth and contemplate splendor, to bask in the blessing of the crown and sound glory, to utter praises and link letters, to utter names and behold what is above and below, to know the meaning of the living and see the vision of the dead, to ford rivers of fire and know lightning, is from the poems of the palaces or chechalot songs of late antiquity, where the original Aramaic is spoken by a voice emerging from beneath the throne of glory, the glory of the name. Moshe Idel, whose recent reflections on broken theologies and the sonic dimensions of Kabbalistic and Hasidic prayer have brought me to many of the passages I'm drawing on here, takes up the phenomenon of linking letters and uttering names, and also the notion of chituch ha'otiyot, the cutting of the letters in study and prayer. When Almog was talking about, you were talking about that today, the title of Shvaz Salhuv's poem, book. Yep. What's that? Torah Chituchim. And I was wondering, is there a connection? But there's no connection, except maybe there really is. Anyway, so Idel's talking about the notion of chituch ha'otiyot, the cutting of the letters in study and prayer, by which he means the clear and often loud articulation of what one is saying, with an emphasis on the sounding of what's being recited or sung and an entrance into its depths. Cordovero, Idel comments, describes the spiritual force that enters the letters through the letters themselves. That is, in a given alignment and at a certain pitch, these letters draw down into themselves a high-tension charge capable in this mythic scheme of creating worlds and semblances of worlds, of altering the nature and aspect of things and people among them. Elsewhere, Idel cites a compilation of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings by Aaron of Apt. During prayer, one should draw all one's power into the acts of speech and proceed from one letter and sound to another, thinking that the letters combine and become linked to one another of their own accord, which is a great delight. An oddly similar sort of literary delectation comes through this most Jewish of passages, bringing us to the great anti-Semite Ezra Pound, who spoke of a virtue by which, I see the problem. I myself am guilty of we're on section 4, which is called virtue. Inklinging, and I missed that one. Okay, all right. Idel cites a compilation of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings by Aaron of Apt. During prayer, one should draw all one's power into the acts of speech and proceed from one letter and sound to another, thinking that the letters combine and become linked to one another of their own accord, which is a great delight. An oddly similar sort of literary delectation comes through this most Jewish of passages, bringing us to Ezra Pound, who spoke of a virtue by means of which an artist draws latent forces, or things present but unnoticed, or things perhaps taken for granted but never examined, a process he describes as a peculiar energy that augments the force of words and holds within it or becomes the power of tradition. That's Pound. Both of these passages, Pound and the Baal Shem Tov, a sentence that has never before been uttered in the history of English, recall the Zohar on Song of Songs, where the circa 13th century gloss reveals an alternative notion of what it is that the song's lovers are in fact up to. Speaking of the male and female letters at the beginning of creation, the Zohar reads, "Draw me after you," each letter called, saying, "Draw me after you, let us run." So too the Magid of Mezerich, Dov Be'er, notes that the pronounced articulated letters are called palaces into which an aspirant enters if he is deemed worthy by the spiritual powers that be. If he is unworthy, alien thoughts drive him away. To enter the palace, concludes Edel, to cleave to the spiritual force leads to the material aspect or sounds of the letters. And maybe it's the other way around as well, at least in the arts, not just for art's sake, into the material aspect, an entry into the material aspect of the sounded letters leads to force in the spirit and breath. 5. Make sure I have this one. In short, the Hebrew, and by extension, all letters and their sounding, what one 15th century Spanish Kabbalist had called vessels of the inner intellects, were coming to new life for me within the palaces of those Baqashot, and inside the winter room where they were sung. On their own and in constellation, the hymns were taking on depth, timbre, brightness, and direction, liquidity and heft, shadow, luster, warmth, and color as they echoed and reflected one another, rotated in a choreography of voicings. And behold, Cordovero reports, the voices and realities of the letters produced by the twist of the lips bestow on them a certain act and movement like that of a body. V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. As the people in Exodus 20 saw the sounds, or see the sounds, the music acting like the acoustic equivalent of a prism, cracking the words open, releasing that light we keep hearing about, and raising the roof beam of that palace each word has become. Shmorna otanu b'yom zeh uv'chol yom. Keep or protect us on this day and every day. So the almost painful beauty, the peculiar balance under pressure of the music itself would create the protection it was seeking. 6. Jewish tradition's emphasis on the hard-grinding law and bristle-splitting analytics of rabbinic commentary notwithstanding, informed observers from the 3rd century of the Common Era on have proposed that the expanse of the history of Israel might be viewed as a succession of sacred songs, beginning with the lost song of the night before the Exodus and arcing through the entirety of biblical poetry and into the thousands of piyutim from late antiquity and the Sephardic, Ashkenazic, Italian, North African, and Yemenite Middle Ages into the early modern period, and chronomythologically ending with the song to be sung with the Messiah's arrival, Isaiah 42:10. Sing a new song unto Yud-He Vav-He, and his praise from the ends of the earth. Ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and all the inhabitants thereof. As a warrior he, Yud-He Vav-He, shall go forth. He shall stir up jealousy like a man of battle. He shall cry, yea, and roar against his enemies. He shall prevail. Which returns us to the first extant song on the all-time up-to-then top 10 list offered by Shirta, the early midrashic work that forms part of the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, namely Exodus 15, 1 through 18, more commonly known as the Song of the Sea. Both of these poems, curiously or significantly, imagine Yud-He Vav-He as a man of battle or a man of war, aligning song, poetry, and struggle on an axis or even an axle around which Jewish outer and inner history turns and evolves. A distant reverberation of that foundational poem at the threshold of Israel's peoplehood resounds quietly toward the end of the Baqashot cycle in the final line of the hymn, Or Tzach V'Pashut, light, pure, and simple, or elemental, by the 19th century Aleppan rabbi, Paitan, and Kabbalist Avraham Antibi. The final line of that hymn rings a critical change on the Song of the Sea's introductory verse, one of the most well-known in all of Jewish literature, as it is recited twice each day as part of the liturgy, in addition to the other recitations on holidays. Az yashir Moshe uvnei Yisrael et hashira hazot. Then Moses sang, or thus Moses sings, or will sing, and the children of Israel this song. In the later petitionary hymn, or Baqashot, the third-person singular perspective of the biblical verse morphs into the first person. And each of the midnight risers sings out, Az ashir hashira hazot. So I sing, or will sing, this song, the ambiguous biblical tense much argued over in the commentaries, shifting into the ritual present with its taste, that again, and glimpse through sound of the messianic future and the new life to come. Just as the passages from Isaiah and the Song of the Sea commemorate and continually anticipate a mythic redemption and release from subjection, so this Baqashot points to an end time suffused by the light of the 10 Sefirot, the rectified cosmos or world of Tikkun, down through which Antibi's hymn itself slowly spins. All this while the actual light of dawn approaches. And so, light, pure, and not so simple. Or as Einstein is more or less said to have put it, keep it simple, but not simpler than it is. Early on in the night, we'd encountered a particularly spirited sequence of hymns, one that brings us into a mythic identification raised to a still higher lyric intensity by the solo improvisations woven through it. Here, too, the words of the hymns highlight the real-time hour of the rite and superimpose it onto the biblical and mytho-historical background as the delicious voicings bring the passage to its height and the night to one of its purest expressions of the delight the group is taking in song, and powerfully in a passage from Job. Let's see if this one works.
גויים מאוד.
When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, in each and every letter, articulated letter, said the Baal Shem Tov, there are worlds and souls in divinity. And here, in a cosmic Russian doll-like fashion, through a series of infinite refractions, we sense them there in the sounds themselves, with the soloist reaching and being led beyond himself, as it were, rising to the sublime or up against the limit and edgy occasion, where the stars and heavenly hosts take their place in the enhanced or even enchanted choir, which summons by association Wallace Stevens' enchanted space. It only adds to the greatness of the moment and its pathos that the words themselves are from Job 38, where God tells the struggling and resistant Job that he, Job, knows and understands nothing about any of this. Lifted by the music as though in the verbal equivalent of a wrestler's reversal, which we might pronounce here reversal. The words at once invoke and depict the angels on high as they summon the shabbier but transformed chorus directly before the singer. Repetition or reversing here through poetry radically recalibrates the dramatic and psychic state of the group as a whole and its parts. When you recall into this mix and take seriously the Talmud's commenting that everyday ministering angels are created from the fiery stream and utter song and cease to be, and that as new water flows from the well each hour, so Israel renews its song. And if you add to that a knowledge of the probably early medieval work known as Perek Shirah, the chapter of song, in which all of creation, from stars, bats, weasels, and figs, to elephants, grasses, vermin, frogs, and dogs, sing in praise of the Creator. And even if you don't, it becomes clear that poetry and song in this matrix do not simply adorn the tradition like baubles on the Jewish tree of life. They act as key elements in its pneumatic or pulmonary system, which is one eccentric but relevant way of reading yet another scriptural verse mentioning the battle in which Israel, the ongoing struggle, the Israel of wrestling with power and strength and an all too palpable sense of the vital divine and sublime, needs to be guided by faith in its elusive God of becoming. Hear, O Israel, says Deuteronomy 23:4, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart be faint, for the Lord God, Yud He Vav He, is he who goes with you. Hearing, in other words, listening, itself becomes, in that analogical reading, the act that arms us for the struggle that matters, the struggle that takes us to the sea and its crossing, and that might well be the new song pertaining to a new life. In fact, Paul Valéry suggests in poetry an abstract thought, sounding a little like a Cordoveran, or one of the writers of the Sufi epistles of music, the poet has indeed a kind of spiritual energy of a special nature. It is manifested in him and reveals him to himself in certain moments of infinite worth, infinite for him. Poetry is an art of language. Certain combinations of words can produce an emotion that others do not produce. I recognize it in myself by this, that all possible objects of the ordinary world, external or internal, beings, events, feelings, and actions, while keeping their usual appearance, somehow change in value. They attract one another. They are connected in ways quite different from the ordinary. They become, if you will permit the expression, musicalized, resonant, and, as it were, harmonically related. 7. We might call it a poetics of magical thickening rather than thinking, or simply a conspicuous listening. Not that thought with its quiver of abstractions doesn't come into play. It does, but as play. And more, forgive me, pronounced in the cutting of letters I'm trying to account for here, is an ordinary sort of miracle that's made in the mouth by a chorus of singers, or a choir of one with her lifetime of memories and aspirations silently sounding the words to a poem in the process of becoming itself for the reader and poet. Ask, says Coleridge in his philosophical lectures. And in the very energy of asking, the energy of the soul to act is by the divine grace made to be the very means of strength, made to be the very wing by which you are to fly and from which alone you can. Our opiated genius has prayer in mind, but it could be the magic of composition itself, an inward omening, as he put it. And the emotional distance a poem travels from nothing to something and sometimes to something like everything, in translation too, which is also a requesting of presence. Like prayer, poetry becomes possible only through an entrance into the force field of its impossibility, that sea which hasn't yet split, where language is never quite up to the task, and yet its not being up to it is part of what makes it right for the job. Magical is a word that in our culture arouses suspicion, writes Thomas Green, one of Coleridge's exemplary explicators. But this justified suspicion can inhibit the perception that language, like all signs, depends upon a fundamental magic that we need to function as human beings. Without that magic, we are helpless. Valerie's classic, and in this case, equal parts comic and cosmic example of this functional magic we need in our lives is the question, can you give me a light? 8. Sliding back towards sound itself, we find British tenor Ian Bostridge, one of our age's master melders of word and melody, writing about the largely lost connection between metaphysics or cosmology and the strange, sympathetic, magical power of music, as he concludes that music remains one of our few approved routes into exercising a magical sensibility, a sense of the supernatural, the transcendent, the ineffable. And when it comes to what matters most, it's either that basic magic and music and meaning, meaning making, or what Wallace Stevens calls the rotted names. Throw away the lights, the definition, he writes, in The Man with the Blue Guitar, and say of what you see in the dark that it is that, or that it is this, but do not use the rotted names. Some questions, then, it isn't too late to ask a little bluntly. What might a phrase like spiritual energy or spiritual power actually mean to us now? Ruchaniyut in the medieval and Hasidic text we've been hearing from. When it comes to a 20th century French modernist poet say, let alone in relation to Hebrew hymns that are sung week after week and year after year, taking its singers from autumn through winter to spring. And how, if at all, might that complex meaning and the pleasure and challenge it affords be translated into our 21st century notion of the poem beyond the asking of these Hebrew hymns? i.e., what exactly, or even approximately, remains of the term once we're outside the immediate circle of belief and practice that gave rise to this Sufi-influenced offshoot of Hebrew literature in the 16th century and has in some measure sustained small communities of its extenders since. And most critically, in this contemporary literary context, what is that petitionary poetry worth as poetry unless it can compel us, however momentarily, to suspend our own or simply not quite belief in its theological premises so that it might survive beyond those theological premises through translation to other contexts. In his Literaria Biographia, Coleridge speaks of that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which he says constitutes poetic faith. Spiritual power, as in Merriam-Webster's primary entry for the former term, relating to or affecting an animating vital principle held to give life to physical organisms, etymologically rooted in a breathing and discernible in respiration and inspiration, and for the latter, the ability to act or produce an effect, i.e., to make something happen. While, as we know from Auden and from Adorno, poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from the ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, wrought towns that we believe in and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. How to understand that, how to understand a happening like that in relation to all we've been talking about, not just in my talk, but over the last 2 days. Do we read Auden's first line of the stanza as a letdown or resigned sigh, poetry makes nothing happen? Or should it be, poetry makes nothing happen? As it clearly did for the Kabbalists who first developed the Baqashot rite and who seemed to know long before Stevens of the nothing that's not there and the nothing that is. That kind of happening and survival. As in Cordovero's saying that the highest realm of the teaching study treats, quote, the spiritual force of the letters and their reality and compositional relationship to one another. This because someone who truly fathoms this matter will be able to create worlds. And isn't this what's at stake in the return to the scene of composition? The alteration of consciousness and the creation of worlds through a verbal magic that brings poems to life and our lives to poetry with an eerie sense of the inevitable. How did that happen? We're left asking when it does. What a jip that there is unendingness, but we, or I, only get to sense it. Floats up from an early 1970s James Schuyler poem called Labor Day, which is anything but a jip because it yields in its subtle manipulation of letters a glimpse of that unendingness, shimmering there, simultaneously trapped and released in the poem. Spirit, in other words, is mattering. It is difficult to get the news from poems, William Carlos Williams writes, in one now very famous one, thinking perhaps of the soul-crushing absence of that filamental intensity linking our letters. Yet, he says, men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. 9. One goes into the outer dark to sing Baqashot as one embraces a darkness within to overcome it. The hymns sing of it, sometimes directly, the singing itself bringing the limited triumph about as the shifting mail-like weave of the Hebrew acts as a talisman. Yimutai kalu tzvaot, itotai chalfu tzvaot, ototai chish el tzvaot, ad matai ketzaplaot. My days swift, sorry about that. My days swift as deer, my times pass with their throngs. Make haste, Lord of hosts, with my signs. How long before the bewilderment ends? In the depth of the divine hiddenness, all turned upon itself, submits Sviver Blovsky, reflecting on the psychological aspects of Kabbalistic thought and practice. There occurs a primordial initial wrench by which that concealment begins to turn outward, to unfold, to exist. Words lifted by music, as gospel-like hymns of petition, or through the artful liminal and continual reconfiguration of alphabets as the turning of verse, in their way, embody that wrench and rotation that might link what's within and without. That first year at the Mosiah Synagogue, when I asked the much older Kurdish friend who'd taken me to the Baqashot what it is we were singing, apart from the Psalms I recognize, He waved his hand in a complicated gesture of recognition and dismissal, then mumbled, Tehillim, Putim, Kabbalah, Lo Tavin. You wouldn't understand, which was true, but also not. Moshe Idel, considering what he calls linguistic magic and talismanic language, writes in a number of places about the Italian Jewish Renaissance rabbi and scholar Yochanan Almano, who was examining the valent force that music in general, but especially the music of words, releases through worshipers of various stripes. Even for people who choose certain times and arise in order to pray and supplicate and do not understand what they're saying, writes Alamano in Cheshek Shlomo, or Solomon's Desire, his commentary on the Song of Songs. They too receive the influxes that are ready to come into those prayers. But he goes further still, speaking of the miracles realized by the means of utterances emerging from the mouths of these persons praying who do not even know or understand the meaning of what they are uttering. All this, he says, is brought about by means of the movements of the places of articulation that are in the soul of man created to pronounce the letters. Elsewhere in the book, Alamano, as Idel reads him, seems to be taking the stunning step of equating Shirah with Kabbalah, poetry and Kabbalah, and both with what he calls Kesher HaMitziut, which we might translate as the linkage or even not of existence, or the real, akin perhaps to Wallace Stevens' account of one winter hearing something like a new knowledge of reality and a scrawny cry from outside, a bird's cry at daylight, a chorister whose sea precedes the choir. At which point, I can't help but downshift further through the literary or cultural plane of Adorno's demythologized prayer and note that Almano on the experience of lyric complexity sounds a little bit like a museum docent on modern art, or Gertrude Stein, Dada's mama, on how best to absorb her own work. I mean by understanding enjoyment, she says. If you enjoy it, you understand it. And lots of people have enjoyed it, so lots of people have understood it. Talking about her own work. No less intuitive when it comes to it is T.S. Eliot's remembering back to his student days when, as he put it, I was passionately fond of certain French poetry long before I could have translated 2 verses of it correctly. With Dante, the discrepancy between enjoyment and understanding was wider still. Genuine poetry, he writes, can communicate before it's understood. There are works and days, subjects, structures, and relations that as a poet and translator of things encountered and taken in, one returns to over and over and over again out of a certain instinctive sense or attraction, or because there is something about them that hasn't yet been fathomed, or because they hold so very much that understanding will always be out ahead of one as an overtone, an oral meniscus, or within our words as a pitch or timbre or vibration that's somehow beneath the voice, constantly changing in response to everything around it, and therefore at least potentially always about to be new. In my case, charged fields of appeal were lurking in these petitions all along. The spell of song and the valence of betweenness, the transmissional magic of the sprung mysticism, the strangely tidal tug of sacrifice displaced onto letters and lips, translation from inner to outer and back, materiality or the physical meeting and meaning, the metaphysical, the musical ear in tension with the imaging eye. All these conducted along modal soundings drew me into the sublime and subliminal tones of the broken open Baqashot in the Bukharan quarter night, and through the years, alone with those cassettes or rememberings real. And really, how does one translate that? There is a score. There is a score to all that isn't said, a constant buzz or hum enlarged, a pulse that soon becomes like something sung or spoken within. There is a string. No, there are wavering violins. We bring a tension like a wish, a wind along a wall or laundry line, and clothespins marking time with keys shifting through an unquaint calm. And now a chaos of tangled thinkings twine in a drawer, a silent roar. The world is bound by secret knots, they say. Though what that means is hard to know and flickers so also. And really, are those knots a noose that hangs or ties that bind? Are being stuck or held together like a bridge to build and cross or maybe draw on or up so no one can? There is a score to all that. Thank you very much. With musicians indoors, I should just read the whole thing again, no? Sure.
So Peter has graciously agreed to answer some questions. So I'll just ask you, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic.
Say, I warned you that after a talk like this, I don't know that there's going to be questions, but don't be, ask anything you want.
What is left unanswered?
Yeah.
But yes, I will bring you the mic so people online can hear you as well. Thank you.
What did I have for breakfast?
I have one question. You returned to it at the very end, but I was wondering about the cassette. If you could talk a little bit.
I love those cassettes.
Yes.
What exactly are you wondering?
If you return to it regularly, when do you listen to it? Do you forget about it for a few years and then come back to it? And,
so these are
also it's materiality. You have this.
Yeah. Materiality that's materiality
yeah.
that in itself is crumbling and drying up in the Jerusalem air and all that stuff. That's actually a wonderfully mysterious question. It works just like Paul Valéry is saying, suddenly everything becomes more interesting, right? All these things. So first of all, when they gave me these pile of cassettes, it was like I said at the beginning of this talk, I was incredibly touched. Basically, this was 1981. So we've talked about the extension of Piyut and the new Piyut and the revival and extension and all that. That wasn't happening then, I can tell you that. The Baqashot took place in the Ada synagogue in Nachlaot and then in the Bukhari synagogue. Those were the only two places. 3 o'clock in the morning, you had to sacrifice to hear this stuff. I was basically the only white guy, to put it in my terms at those times, or at least the terms of Musrara, where I live now, in the synagogue, and a lot of the guys there would have, after once they saw that I was coming a lot, and I'd come every week, and we would walk out of the Bukhari court together. They'd say, "Why do you come here? What do you see in this music? Like, what do you? This isn't, They weren't saying you don't belong here. They weren't saying that. They were trying to figure out, did I really like this stuff? Which is sort of the way. I'm not one to play the Orientalist card and dump on Ashkenazic scholars of Sephardic poetry. I'm not, because I think their achievement is just titanic. But we need, obviously there are things that they didn't see. But I have had people in the field say to me when I started learning Arabic and translating Palestinian, Peter, you listen to Arabic music? You really like that? Like they could confide in me. Like, how is it possible, to like that? So the fact that they gave me these cassettes, I just was moved beyond belief. And yes, I listen to them pretty regularly. There are periods will go by where I'm onto something else and I don't, but I go back to them pretty regularly, and sort of testament to that is that crumbling of the. I still have the original cassettes, but about 10 years ago, teaching at Yale, I thought, oh, now I'm a professor. I have perks, like I can go to the tech lab for free and have these turned on to put on CDs. Like somebody can do that for me. So I could use them in class. And so that was great. At least if the cassettes crumbled, I would have the CD. And then a couple years ago, I co-taught, of course, the mystical poetry of Judaism and Islam with Shaukat Turawa. And we wanted to play a lot of this stuff. And I thought, oh, well, CDs, like, who has CDs anymore and where do you find them? So I went to the Yale sound studio, and I had done a bunch of things there. I knew the guy. And he said he digitized them for me. And how much would it cost? He said, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out. And so we just started talking, and he's listening to the music. He said, you don't have to pay for this. So I now have it in 3 different formats, which is some kind of extension also. But I still like those cassettes because I love the scratchy, this scratchiness is on the digitization, but there's just something about there's no production, they're the titles of the Pew team, and that's it. There's no notes, there's no scholarly anything. It just, they did it, So yeah, that's probably, and they also gave me the Baqashot book, one of the little books, and I have a bunch of others, but that's a kind of prized possession.
Thank you so much. I'm deeply moved. You know that some dancers are in your audience. So
some dancers are in my
firstly,
genes.
I
Well,
thank you I thank you for the choreographic knowledge via your mother, who is a great dancer, a great American dancer. But can you talk about this last slide, which to me looks like a dance score, and I wonder if the men ever get up and move, that you watched all night, and is this your rendering, listening to the sound, or tell us more, please?
So I could talk about this for a long time. If you come to the Drawing Center in New York on December 6th, I will talk about it, but do they move? Well, we saw that one video clip. That guy was moving. He wasn't, it was like sort of, Adar, you were talking about, and you showed that clip, right, of Schneerson. And it doesn't take a lot of movement to convey serious knowledge and serious embodiment. So when that guy is singing that solo, I mean, he's out there, right? Also, I'm interested in all the movement in the synagogue around him. They're talking to each other, they're giving out the next solo and the next chorus, and it's all this kind of quiet choreography, and they're signaling to each other. I find that really, really beautiful. So there's that. The other kind of moves you would find in the Messiah Synagogue at that point would be sort of distributing the food constantly and the drink, and then fights. There would not often be fights, but there were a lot of tempers, and a lot of people are drinking, and it's late at night, you're tired, and maybe you've known this person for 20 years, and something just happened. So, but again, it was real. It was totally real. There was nothing sanctimonious about it. There was nothing like dancing. That would never, that wouldn't be part of it. This slide, so this is an artist named Terry Winters, who I've been doing a lot of work with lately in this new book that Shir mentioned called Draw Me After. In a way, started because he asked me to write about his drawings. He's a very well-known American artist. And so Draw Me After is the famous, I quoted from the line from the Song of Songs, but when you put it on a cover, this isn't the cover, but it's some cover or something like that. If you put Draw Me After on this, everybody thinks it's about drawing. And that's sort of what I want, is to draw these, like Peter says, draw these different arts together, and because they take you beyond yourself. And this is one of the drawings he gave me that was in the exhibit at the Drawing Center in New York about 5 years ago. And so we've worked with different permutations, and I did a chapbook called On Being Drawn, right? Which is really, so yeah, it's the act of drawing, but it's about being susceptible, on being drawn, allowing yourself to be susceptible, to be drawn out. And I did a chapbook where these poems were reproduced with some of the images, and then I wrote a commentary, and I called it I called the poem an ekphrastic translation. In other words, that the poetry was a translation of, so the poem that I just read was a translation of this drawing. And I think really of all poetry as that, when I'm writing my original poetry, most of the time you don't know what the original experience is, which saves me. People don't look over your shoulder and say, you made a mistake. But the same, like we all look at this drawing, we're going to see different things. So that's sort of some of what's, it's in this new book of poems, but it's really, it relates directly to my thoughts about the Baqashot. And as I wrote this talk, this is the kind of stuff I've been thinking about the last 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Peter, thank you so much.
You're welcome so much.
When I teach Baqashot here in America, at a certain time, I switch the translation of the term, and I always thought, well, I should ask Peter Cole once whether the switch I'm making makes sense. So instead of petitions, I translate that as songs of seeking, to seek, which, first of all, makes the action of singing the Baqashot a little bit more humble. You're not coming with a list of requests,
Right.
but you actually get up in the middle of the night to look for God,
Right.
to seek
Shocher.
Him. And this is what certainly Shachar Baqashot
Right.
meant. Okay, it's not that I will
Right.
get up in the morning to make petitions, but I will search for you
Right.
at that time.
Yeah.
Do you think I'm
the-
mistaken? And don't tell me that, because I have already spread this gospel for a long time.
First of all, when you're teaching, everything is temporary. You're just, it's a relationship you have in the moment. So you can say anything you want. Same with when I use the word petition here. It's not written in stone. The only reason I use petition here is so that I can say repetition. That's the only reason, right? The word petition is not an interesting word. It's a political thing. We have a petition, we sign a petition. The word seek is almost as bad, or maybe worse. So you need to come up with a. You need to come up with a playmate with the word seek to animate it. But yeah, that's the Stevens thing. Do not use the rotted names. That's sort of my motto. I think I could have it. When you were reading this morning on your panel, the letter M was projected on your head. It was some kind of golem thing. I thought, what's going to happen now? So I feel like I should have "do not use the rotted names" tattooed on my forehead. Rolly, you had a question.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So just to add also my gratitude, it was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Musically, also. So we're here speaking about the revival of the contemporary piyut and like hoping for it in a way. It's so fragile, as we know. And you're speaking about the 80s, and like I imagine, since I know that you're still spending a lot of time in Jerusalem, so you have also the sense of what is happening now, also in the scene of Baqashot. So I wonder, we're speaking about, we're very, happy with ourselves, speaking about revival of piyutim. What have we lost? I mean, there's something there in that innocence of the 80s when it was more isolated, not known to many people, maybe more close, social kind of environments. I have a feeling that there's some, of course, it's also natural.
Right.
And you always like to also, look with nostalgia on the past. But it seems that there's a quality there that at least we have to acknowledge that was there, and at this time of there's more awareness and openness, maybe something's also lost.
Yeah. So, who am I to judge? I don't go to a lot of things now. You know, once when I was going, and so I didn't just go at the beginning. I went for 2 or 3 years steadily. It was only when I got a full-time job teaching at the Gymnasia Rechavia that spending Friday night, all of Friday, I needed my sleep. That's at a certain point I realized But there was also kind of sociological things, like I would bring some of my literary friends who, you know, religion for them was like, they would ask me to bring their children to a synagogue before the bar mitzvah age, so that at least they'll have been in the synagogue once in their lives, you know. And when I would bring them, they would say, "Cool, you know, everybody here voted Likud." Back to Rafi's film, and this was the early 80s, right? So there was a whole, everything kind of shifted. The whole notion, it was so loose. That's what I loved about it. So it wasn't, you could call it an innocence. There was something. I don't like to use the word purity, but that was so impure that it was pure, right? You know, back to Stephen, the imperfect is our paradise. Like, there was just, I don't know. Yes, deep down I agree with you, but I also really value, and this is one of the things that was good for me these last 2 days to hear, things. José Saramago, the great Portuguese novelist, said in talking about translation of his own work and praising his translator, that translation is the art of proving that things have to change in order to go on remaining the same. And so you can't freeze these things in a moment. Baqashot is staying alive in some totally unpredicted, you know, we couldn't have predicted it, way. And yes, maybe the access is easier now, and you can go to the concerts at Beta Confederacia in Jerusalem or wherever they are. And but that's a moment in time now in its evolution. And there are still all avenues, different avenues of access, whether it's hearing Moshe Chabusha or yourself and your ensemble. And so I think we need to just be aware of, yes, tune yourself sometimes to this guy singing Baron Yachad and the group in general and the kids there and all of that. But also let it evolve and try to guide it. Those who know, try to guide it. And, you know, I'm not really the one to say. Because the worst thing you could say is, those were the good old days. That's a kind of, you know, that's not going to help.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have a question that's maybe not such a scholarly question, but sort of related to this theme of nostalgia. I'm wondering if after you stopped going to these communities, did you go back? And if so, how was the experience? And did it adapt how you think about these Baqashot? And I'm sort of thinking about it as like, does that layer of nostalgia add something to the feeling that you have around them and how you interpret that feeling? And does that change once you revisit it, or?
Yeah, so the only time I haven't actually gone back to the Messiah, first of all, it's been completely renovated, and I don't, it's hard for me to, that was 40 years ago. I can't even imagine that I could say that and not born yet, you know. I mean, I'm 65 now, and it's crazy to me that so I kind of don't want to compare. Like, that was very intense for me, and then just sort of let it go. I stayed in touch with, and he actually is in the video clip, I stayed in touch for quite a while with the guy who first brought me there, who I consider it like one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given. And all that started was because he was a family friend, and he found me a place to live in Nachalat Shiva before, for those of you know Jerusalem, before it was renovated, and which was also quite something. And he said, "You seem like you're an adventurer. You wanna see something different? I'll meet you at 2:30 in the morning on Friday night." But there is the whole political, sociological scene in Jerusalem has changed so much, and there's just much harder for me to enter it, and things are, the relationship to religiosity, the groups that sing Baqashot and Musayaf now, because I've looked at a lot of YouTube and films and stuff, it's a much more religious, stricter kind of sense, I think, than it used to be. So it's not something that really draws me. But I do sort of fantasize about it. And I'll probably go back at some point.
Thank you for the profusion of it all. I think that profusion speaks to how music works, that overflow. So you've done something very beautiful, I think, in illuminating how this musical experience affects us. So the overflowing of boundaries. This is not a question, but just an observation of that video sample of the soloist who went on and on the word boker. It seemed like such a perfect example of extracting light from the vessels of sound. I mean, it was an endless morning.
Right. Which hadn't yet come, right?
Yeah.
But
but will be endless when it arrives. Yeah. So I just feel astounded by the ways in which you made us understand music in a more profound way through your words.
Thank you. And that's also why I meant about, I didn't realize, you have no idea how honored I am. I had no idea how honored I am, because it's only the invitation to do this. It's not like I walk around, I walk around with a lot of these thoughts, but it wasn't like I walk around putting all these thoughts together with Baqashot. It's just sort of there, inarticulate, kind of jumbled way. And writing for this occasion helped me bring together something that I think has been lurking in me for a really long time. So that's meant a lot to me also. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm trying not to ask a confusing question. You drew us into many times, but also many spaces, I feel, especially with your insistence upon matter, materiality, embodiment in many ways. And you also ask us to think about poetical thickening rather than thinking. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how the poetical thickening that you experience in your translation then translates in your poetic practice, and then also in the ways you disseminate both your translation work and composition work.
Okay. I don't think I'm confused yet, but let's see what happens when I answer. So the phrase I actually used, poetical thickening and thinking, is fine. The phrase I actually used was magical thickening, because it's magical thinking is a kind of philosophical term and literary term, magic realism and all that. So I was playing on magical thinking and magical thickening, but it is very much poetical thickening. And so both you and Dari yesterday, one of the things I really loved was, I think I talked to some people, but you or forget which privately, but when I teach translation at Yale or other places, I just drill it into my students, and the sort of key place I do it is when I teach a unit on Quranic translation of the Quran, and a particular surah, and I have them listen to recitations and then close their eyes and give me directionality. Where is the sound going? And to make, stand up and do it with their hands, just like you guys did. And this is apart from dance. I'm talking about the dance of music, of language. And it's such a profound thing. I think it changes students' relationship to writing, period. Because so much of talking about literature in an academic context is ideas, themes, critique, all important. But the matter of the material stuff is often not, talked about in that way. So I really feel it's just, that's the way I experience languages on my body like an instrument. I feel it in different places. It gives pleasure. It hurts. Why'd they do that? And often what I feel is thinness. Nothing's happening. And not that you have to lay it on so thick. No, it's a question of tact. Right? Every poem, every work of prose, it has its appropriate, its occasion, its appropriate thickness, let's say, which is, again, evolves over the course of a piece. But becoming aware of language, of talking about language in these other ways, using often the other arts to do that, I just think is really important for young readers and for anybody who cares about literature. So it's something I sort of objectify in my teachings to make it so I can pass it on. It's something I've learned from my teachers, not necessarily teachers in the class, but my teachers in books and certain poets that I've known. And it's easier to do it in translation because ego is not involved. We have the text where everybody can be a little more objective about a common text that we're looking at. But once you understand how language works in that material way, then you can apply it to everything. And it's the same whether you're translating a law document or a political speech, or it's just you have an ear for what's demanded of a given occasion, or when you're writing your own things. Sometimes, like in the poem I read you of mine at the end, so that's a thicker kind of materiality, and I'm doing that on purpose. It's a way of drawing attention to the materiality of language while still communicating. Like that poem, you can grammatically scan that poem. Like you have to work at it. So maybe take 3 people to grammatically scan it, but you can have that. What that does is, I think Hadar, you said it yesterday with when we were doing the vowels, and somebody from the audience said, "Oh yes, I feel this one going back around me." So that's what I want to feel. I want people to feel language taking over them, being more than just what it means semantically, thematically, and all that. So, how'd I do? Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. First, I would like to share that in a class on translation, I brought to the students your translations to Sephardic poetry without telling them who are the poets and who is the translator, to translate it back into Hebrew, but without telling them that it's originally in Hebrew. And we got very different, like Ibn Gabirol and Yehuda Levi brought into 21st century Hebrew without thinking that they are translating and not
Al-Tishali.
Exactly. And thinking about that and about reading your translations, and I think like in the experience of reading those poems in Hebrew and then reading the translations, that in a sense, like when we read it in Hebrew, like many of the words, many of the ways that words connect to one another if we know them already from another source, biblical or later on, in a way we take them like they're very clear. We automatically understand them in a certain way that we think that is connected to the source that it's taken from. And then reading it in English, it's like, it's looking at it like all the combinations are opened again for interpretation. Like it's not automatically that common sense of going to what you knew about it, but thinking, so this effect, you know, of reading translation of something that you already know in the original, but in this context specifically, like I think that there is something with the way that we read Sephardic poetry. Some of it, like when you read a lot of it and you kind of atomize in certain parts of it, that the translation for me reading it was very liberating. Now, I guess that for you, like the experience, right, as reading it like you really read a poem when you translate it. Right? Before that, you just look at it. But the real reading happens with the translation. Like, I don't know if like the experience was of how to open it again in a way that, you know, will bring meanings that in Hebrew, in a sense, were lost because they're already atomized in the language and now can be rediscovered in English. Like it's very interesting for me, like what was the experience in translating it? And also like what did you seek in the way of moving it from Hebrew into English?
So those are huge, wonderful things to talk about. I'll try to keep it brief. Maybe also by starting anecdotally, where the great historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who I only met twice in my life, but he played a key role in my whole sort of Andalusi journey. And it started because I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I had just begun translating Shmuel HaNagid. I've sort of told this story in some places, but probably this is not an audience that would have come to those places. So I had tried to translate HaNagid when I first was in Jerusalem in first living there in 1981, let's say. And it didn't exactly work. My Hebrew was good, but it wasn't really good enough. And some close friends said, you know, maybe you shouldn't show those translations to anybody. And I did put them away. And then like 7 or 8 years later, sitting in a diner in San Francisco one morning, waiting for the football game to come on the TV, just a poem just burst up inside me. And I began translating. I thought, now I know how to do this. Which didn't mean that it went smoothly, but I understood the principle. I understood something that I had to get. And so I was very high on all this stuff, and then Yerushalmi came to town and gave a talk on Maranos and something. And somebody, a former student of his, introduced me. He said, "This is Peter Cole. He's translating Shmuel HaNagid." And Yerushalmi was actually quite short, but in my mind, I looked up at him. He was very tall, and he said, "Of course, you must have to make terrible compromises." And I don't know what happened. An angel came and landed on my shoulder, and I said, "No. You will have to make terrible compromises." And we became friends, you know. And so that's the thing, is when you know the original like you do, you've got all kinds of interferences. It's almost hard to read a translation, right? Because you're bringing so much to the table. So I'm not really translating for you. I'm translating for the person who hasn't had a pleasure, the complicated pleasure of Ibn Gabirol. But the second thing is that I've had a lot of Israeli, I don't want to say but a number of literary Israeli friends have said to me something similar. Said, you know, Shirat Yemei Beinayim, medieval Hebrew poetry, we're so habituated to it. We've been taught a certain way, either taught to hate it because of high school, or just the way it's been passed down in the culture has not gone particularly well. And seeing it through the lens of your English, makes it interesting again. You know, so that was a lesson for me. I mean, yeah, okay, it's flattering, but it's more. There's more than that. There's a lesson, which is that's all the stuff they say about translation is true. Like, it does pass things on, and it's very, you know, that gilgul, that transmigration of soul talk is there's reasons these metaphors are used. So there's that. The question of, you know, like, what am I trying for? When I teach translation, also I'm known as the guy of the one thing, and it's this a little trick I developed over the years because everybody at this conference, everybody talks to me about translation. That's it. It's a lot harder to talk about. What's the last poem you wrote? And you know, no. What are you translating now? What languages? That's easy. So, and almost always it's, you know, compromise, things are lost, what's going on. So I start the conversation with students and I say, look, let's just agree from the outset, you can't translate everything. Let's even say that you can't translate most of what's there. But you love this poem. What is the one thing that you're going to get down, a gun to your head, or you're going to get down on the ground and you're going to wrestle, right? Jacob and the angel. If you could only get one thing, what's it going to be? And you need to be incredibly clear about that, even if it's just intuitively clear. And I believe, and I think it's true, it's been borne out, if you get that, if you do everything you can to get that one thing, and you're reasonably talented, like Rafi was talking about with the movies you're making, magically things start to come together. And you don't just get the one thing, you get the DNA of the one thing that contains all the other things. That's how it happens. So for each poet, in a way, there was a kind of different one thing, let's say, in the dream of the poem. And there was a bit of terror. Once, you know, I did Hanagid. I thought, oh, okay, he's a great poet. I love him. We had our little thing together. Now I got to do Ibn Gabirol. You know, completely different person, completely different poet. Exact same poetics, right? Same meters, same rhymes, same tricks. Turns out completely different. And that's not the way people have tended historically to write about these people. They tend to write about them as they're all the same, you know. So listening to what is it about each particular poet that I wanted to get across, even before thinking about how to actually do that, was really, I think, the main job, is hearing the differences between them. So anyway, there's a lot more I could say, but that's...
Maybe one more if we have another question. Okay, I think then here is where we'll stop.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, thank you. I feel like you gave us so many gifts. Yeah. And was it Stein that said if we take pleasure in it, it means we understood? Yes, so I think there was great, deep understanding here. So thank you so much. I think we can stop the